when a heavy brass key to a forgotten hillside estate landed in the lap of a debt-ridden single mother. It felt like a miracle, but miracles rarely come with deadbolts installed on the outside of the basement doors. Celine Jenkins thought she was leaving her shattered life behind to start fresh with her 8-year-old son. Instead, she stepped into a century-old web of extortion, buried town secrets, and a haunting truth about her late husband's death. What she found hidden behind the walls of that decaying house didn't just change their lives. It rewrote everything she thought she knew about the man she loved, forcing her into a desperate game of survival. The final eviction notice was taped to the apartment door like a neon sign broadcasting Celine's failure. It was a crisp Tuesday in November, and the wind cutting through the streets of Seattle felt entirely devoid of sympathy. Celine Jenkins, a 32-year-old single mother, stood in the hallway, her fingers numb as she peeled the yellow paper from the cheap veneer of her door. Inside, her 8-year-old son, Leo, was watching cartoons, oblivious to the fact that they had exactly 14 days to find a new home with precisely $42 in their checking account. Life hadn't always been a series of past due bills and panic attacks. 3 years ago, Celine had a husband, a modest house in the suburbs, and a plan, but David's sudden death in a hit-and-run on a rainy interstate had shattered that reality. The life insurance policy had been denied due to a technicality in David's medical history, a technicality Celine hadn't even known about. Since then, it had been a downward spiral of predatory loans, double shifts at a diner, and a suffocating grief that she had to hide for Leo's sake. The ringing of her cell phone startled her. The caller ID displayed a Seattle area code, but the name was unfamiliar. Croft and Associates. "Hello?" Celine answered, her voice trembling slightly. She expected another collection agency. "Am I speaking with Celine Jenkins? Widow of David Jenkins?" The voice was crisp, professional, and female. "Yes, speaking. Mrs. Jenkins, my name is Abigail Croft. I am an estate attorney representing the late. I've been trying to track you down for over a month. I have some rather urgent news regarding your great-aunt's estate." Celine frowned, pushing open her apartment door. "I'm sorry. Who? Mildred Hawthorne? I don't have a great-aunt Mildred. She was your maternal grandfather's sister," Abigail replied smoothly. The rustle of paperwork, audible through the receiver. A recluse, by all accounts. She passed away 6 weeks ago in Oak Haven, Oregon. As her only living blood relative, you are the sole beneficiary of her estate. This includes a property known locally as the Ridge House. Celine sank onto a worn dining chair. The apartment suddenly felt incredibly quiet. "A house? You're saying I own a house?" "Yes, Mrs. Jenkins. Outright. No mortgage. However, the property has sat vacant for a few years, as Mildred was moved to an assisted living facility before her passing. It will require attention, but the deed is yours, pending your signature." 2 days later, Celine and Leo were packed into her sputtering 2009 Honda Civic, everything they owned crammed into trash bags in the trunk. The drive south into Oregon was a blur of towering pines and relentless, misty rain. Oak Haven was a town that time seemed to have forgotten, nestled deep in the coastal mountains. It was a place of logging trucks, rusted diners, and heavy, low-hanging fog. Following the GPS coordinates Abigail Croft had provided, Celine steered the car up a winding, unpaved road that snaked away from the town's center. The trees grew thicker here, their branches arching over the road like skeletal fingers. Then, they saw it. The Ridge House sat on a rocky outcropping overlooking a dark, churning lake. It was a sprawling, 3-story Victorian monstrosity. Its paint, once perhaps a pristine white, had peeled away to reveal grey, weathered wood. A wraparound porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and the tall, narrow windows looked like dark, empty eyes staring down at them. It was beautiful in a terrifying, gothic sort of way. "Is this it, Mom?" Leo asked from the back seat, his small hands gripping his seatbelt. It looks like a haunted house from a movie. It's just old, buddy, Celine said, forcing a cheerful tone she didn't feel. Nothing a little soap and paint can't fix. It's ours. A real home. She parked the car and killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, save for the wind howling through the eaves. As Celine stepped out and approached the heavy oak front door, clutching the heavy brass key the lawyer had overnighted to her, she felt an unmistakable prickle on the back of her neck. It was the distinct, unsettling feeling of being watched. She turned, scanning the tree line. Nothing but shadows and pine needles. She inserted the key. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clunk. As she pushed the door open, a wave of stale air smelling of dried lavender, dust, and something metallic washed over her. She didn't know it yet, but stepping over that threshold was the moment her life irrevocably shifted from a tragedy into a nightmare. The interior of the Ridge House was a perfectly preserved time capsule from the 1970s, draped in the dust of the present. Heavy velvet drapes blocked out the meager afternoon light, casting the living room in a deep, melancholic gloom. Furniture was covered in yellowing white sheets, looking like a gathering of silent ghosts waiting for the new occupants. Okay, Celine breathed, clapping her hands together to dispel the eerie quiet. First things first, let's get some light in here. She spent the first few hours pulling back curtains, ripping sheets off floral sofas, and opening windows to let the sharp mountain air purge the stale smell of abandonment. The house was massive. There was a formal dining room, a library lined with rotting, leather-bound books, and a kitchen that featured appliances Celine had only ever seen in vintage magazines. As they explored the second floor, claiming bedrooms, Celine noticed the first oddity. The house was fastidiously clean beneath the dust. There was no clutter, no personal photographs on the walls, no knickknacks. It felt less like a home, and more like a stage set. But it was on their second day, while trying to locate the main breaker box to fix a blown fuse in the kitchen, that the true strangeness of Mildred Hawthorne's legacy revealed itself. Celine had taken a flashlight and descended the narrow, creaking stairs into the basement. The air down here was significantly colder, smelling sharply of damp earth and concrete. Her flashlight beam swept across a surprisingly large space. But unlike the rest of the house, the basement wasn't empty. The far wall was entirely sectioned off by a modern, heavy-duty steel door. It stood out drastically against the crumbling brick and exposed wooden beams of the century-old foundation. Frowning, Celine approached it. There was no handle, only a thick, industrial-grade padlock securing a heavy iron latch. And strangest of all, the door was designed to keep something in, not out. The heavy hinges were on the outside, facing her. Mom? Celine jumped, spinning around. Leo was standing at the bottom of the stairs, clutching his stuffed bear. It's cold down here, he said, shivering. I know, baby. I'm just looking for the fuse box, Celine said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She guided him back upstairs, her mind racing. Why would an elderly recluse need a steel, padlocked room in her basement? The next morning, Celine was awakened by a sharp, rhythmic tapping on the front door. She threw on a robe and hurried downstairs. Standing on the porch was a man in his late 60s, wearing a plaid hunting jacket and carrying a covered plate. Morning, he boomed cheerfully. Hope I didn't wake you. Saw the lights on last night. I'm Dylan Edward. I live about a mile down the ridge. Celine offered a polite, cautious smile, opening the door just a crack. Hi, Celine Jenkins. Thank you. That's very kind. Brought you some blueberry scones, Dylan said, holding out the plate. His eyes, pale blue and sharp, darted past her, scanning the entryway. Mildred was, well, she kept to herself. We didn't see much of her the last few years. Tragic about her passing. Your family, I assume? Yes, her great niece, Celine said, taking the plate. Ah, Well, it's a big house for a young woman and a little boy, Dylan noted, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Lot of history in these walls. Lot of upkeep. You let me know if you need any help with the heavy lifting. Or, if you find anything you don't know what to do with. The phrasing struck Celine as odd. Find anything? Like what? Dylan chuckled. A dry, raspy sound. Just junk. Old folks collect junk. Mildred was a proud woman, but she was a bit eccentric. Lock her doors. Keep the blinds drawn. Anyway, welcome to Oakhaven. As Dylan walked away, Celine watched him until he disappeared down the winding drive. His visit hadn't felt like a neighborly welcome. It felt like a reconnaissance mission. That afternoon, while Leo was occupied with a puzzle in the living room, Celine drove into town to the local hardware store. She bought a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. She couldn't explain the gnawing anxiety in her gut. But the steel door in the basement was a mystery she could not leave unsolved. She needed to know what her great-aunt was hiding. She needed to know what she had brought her son into. The basement was eerily silent, save for the sound of Celine's heavy breathing and the metallic scrape of the bolt cutters positioning over the thick shackle of the padlock. It took every ounce of strength she possessed, throwing her entire body weight onto the handles. For a moment, she thought she wasn't strong enough. Then, with a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the concrete walls, the steel snapped. Celine let the heavy bolt cutters drop to the floor with a clang. She pulled the broken padlock free and tossed it aside. Her hands were shaking. She took a deep breath, grabbed her heavy flashlight, and pulled the iron latch back. The steel door creaked open, the hinges screaming in protest, as if they hadn't been moved in decades. Celine stepped inside, shining the beam into the pitch black. She reached out, feeling along the wall until her fingers brushed a plastic switch. She flicked it. 3 bare, fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, bathing the room in a harsh, clinical white light. Celine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It wasn't a storage room. It wasn't a wine cellar. It was an office, a meticulous, horrifyingly organized office. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with metal filing cabinets. In the center of the room sat a large, heavy oak desk. On top of the desk were 3 objects: an old-fashioned reel-to-reel tape recorder, a heavy black ledger, and a loaded .38 caliber revolver. What in the world? Celine whispered, stepping fully into the room. The air was dry and smelled strongly of old paper and dust. She walked toward the desk, her eyes locked on the gun. She carefully reached out and nudged it aside, her focus shifting to the heavy black ledger. She opened it. The pages were filled with neat cursive handwriting. It was a list of names, dates, and dollar amounts. Dylan Edward, the 12th of October 2015, $5,000. Delivered. Mayor Thomas Sterling, the 4th of November 2015, $12,000. Delivered. Chief Miller, the 18th of January 2016, $8,000. Delivered. Celine's blood ran cold. This wasn't a diary. It was an extortion ledger. Mildred Hawthorne hadn't been a poor eccentric recluse. She had been blackmailing half the town of Oakhaven. Trembling, Celine turned toward the filing cabinets. Each drawer was labeled alphabetically. She walked over to the cabinet, marked P, and pulled it open. She thumbed through the thick manila folders until she found it. Edward, Dylan. Inside were dozens of photographs, grainy and taken from a distance. They showed Dylan Edward meeting with various young women in motel parking lots, exchanging envelopes of cash. There were bank statements, property deeds, and a signed confession detailing a land fraud scheme that had bankrupted a local family. Aunt Mildred had leverage on everyone. Celine shoved the folder back, a feeling of deep nausea washing over her. She was standing in a room that held enough explosive secrets to tear the entire town apart. No wonder Dylan had come poking around. He wanted to know if she had found the room. Desperate to understand the depth of this madness, Celine moved down the line of cabinets. She didn't know what she was looking for until she reached the cabinet marked J. Her hand froze on the handle. Her maiden name was Collins. Her married name was Jenkins. No, it's impossible, she told herself. David had never even been to Oregon. They met in college in Chicago. He was from Illinois. He had no family left. Slowly, her fingers gripping the metal so tightly her knuckles turned white, she pulled the drawer open. There were only 3 files in the J section. The second one made her heart stop. Jenkins, David, 2018. No, Celine choked out, tears instantly pricking her eyes. She pulled the heavy file from the drawer and carried it to the desk. Her legs feeling like lead, she opened the cover. The very first item was a photograph. It was David, but he looked younger, maybe 22. He was standing on the porch of this very house, the Ridge House, with his arm wrapped around a young woman Celine didn't recognize. Beneath the photograph was a birth certificate. David Thomas Hawthorne, born Oak Haven, Oregon. He had lied to her. His name wasn't Jenkins. He wasn't from Illinois. He was a Hawthorne. He was Mildred's nephew. Celine frantically flipped through the pages. There were newspaper clippings from Oak Haven in 2010 about a tragic boating accident on the lake behind the house. A young woman had drowned. The woman from the photograph. There were police reports, witness statements, and a secondary report, hidden away, detailing a massive payoff to the local sheriff to suppress evidence that David had been driving the boat under the influence. Mildred had covered it up, and she had held it over his head. The final document in the file was a bank transfer receipt dated exactly 3 days before David was killed in that hit and run on the Seattle interstate. He had wired $50,000 to a shell corporation tied to Mildred Hawthorne. The hit and run hadn't been an accident. David had stopped paying. He had tried to break free, and he had been murdered for it. The ledger, the files, the money. It was a death sentence. And now, Celine had inherited it all. Suddenly, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the floorboards directly above her head. Someone was in the house, and Leo was upstairs alone. The heavy thud from the floorboards directly above sent a jolt of pure ice through Celine's veins. Dust sifted down from the exposed basement ceiling, landing on the open ledger in front of her. Someone was in the living room. Someone heavy. And Leo was up there, completely alone, engrossed in a jigsaw puzzle. Panic, primal and suffocating, seized her throat. She didn't think. She reacted. Celine shoved David's file back into the J cabinet, slammed the drawer shut, and grabbed the heavy, iron-cased flashlight from the desk. She looked at the .38 caliber revolver resting on the blotting paper. Her hand hovered over it. She had never fired a gun in her life. If the intruder was armed, a panicked woman with a rusted revolver was more likely to get her son killed than save him. She left the gun, opting for the heavy flashlight instead. She turned off the clinical fluorescent lights, plunging the hidden office back into absolute darkness, and pulled the heavy steel door shut behind her. It didn't lock without a new padlock, but she pushed it flush against the frame, praying the shadows of the basement would conceal the broken latch. Celine crept up the wooden stairs, wincing at every agonizing creak. The kitchen was empty, the fading afternoon light casting long, distorted shadows across the linoleum floor. She gripped the flashlight like a club, her knuckles white, and edged toward the archway leading into the main hallway. "Well, aren't you a quiet one?" A deep, gravelly voice echoed from the living room. Celine rounded the corner, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Standing in the center of the living room, towering over Leo, was a man in a tan uniform. He was broad-shouldered, with a thick, graying mustache and eyes that looked like chips of wet slate. A heavy leather duty belt hung around his waist, the polished grip of his sidearm catching the dim light. The patch on his shoulder read, Oak Haven Police Department. Leo was sitting cross-legged on the rug, clutching a puzzle piece, looking up at the man with wide, uncertain eyes. Step away from my son, Celine demanded. Her voice shook, but the command was sharp enough to slice through the heavy air of the room. The officer turned slowly, his boots thudding against the hardwood floor. He didn't look startled. He looked amused. Mrs. Jenkins, I presume? I said. Step away from him, Celine repeated, moving swiftly across the room. She scooped Leo up by the arm, pulling him behind her legs. Who are you? How did you get in here? The man held up a hand, a gesture of mock surrender. Whoa now. Easy, ma'am. I'm Chief Harrison Miller. Your front door was swinging wide open in the wind. In a town like this, a wide open door on a vacant property is usually an invitation for local teenagers looking to cause trouble. I was just doing a perimeter check and saw the boy. Celine glanced at the front door. It was closed now. Had she left it unlatched? After Dylan Edwards' visit, she couldn't remember. The sheer volume of stress coursing through her body was making her second-guess her own memory. But looking at Chief Miller, she knew with absolute certainty that he was lying. We're fine, Celine said, keeping her chin high. She recognized his name, Chief Miller. The 18th of January, 2016, $8,000. Delivered. The man standing in her living room was on Mildred's payroll. He was part of the extortion web. Glad to hear it, Miller said, his slate eyes lazily dragging over her. They stopped on her hands. Celine realized with a sickening drop in her stomach that her fingers were covered in dark grey grease. From snapping the basement padlock, she quickly wiped them on the sides of her jeans, hoping he wouldn't register the significance. Mildred was a fixture in this town, Miller continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. He was invading her space, testing her boundaries. We kept a close eye on her. She valued her privacy, her security. She had a lot of locks on a lot of doors. Finding anything interesting? As you clean up, the question wasn't idle curiosity. It was a threat. He was fishing. He wanted to know if she had found the basement room. Just dust and old furniture. Celine lied, forcing her voice to remain steady. I haven't had much time to look through anything. We're just trying to get the heat working properly. Miller smiled. But it was a cold, reptilian stretching of his lips. Right. Well, old houses have secrets, Mrs. Jenkins. Sometimes it's mold in the walls. Sometimes it's bad wiring. Best not to go digging too deep without a professional. You never know what might bring the whole structure down on your head. He tipped his hat, the gesture dripping with false courtesy. You lock that front door now. Oakhaven is a quiet place, but we take care of our own. If you need anything, you know where to find me. Celine watched him walk out, her body rigid until she heard the heavy cruiser engine start up and gravel crunch beneath its tires. The moment the sound faded down the ridge, she bolted for the front door, throwing the deadbolt and sliding the heavy brass chain into place. She ran to the back door in the kitchen and did the same. Mom? Leo whispered, tugging at the hem of her sweater. Is that policeman bad? Celine looked down at her son's innocent face, her heart breaking. David had died to keep them away from this town, and now she had walked them right into the center of the trap. No, baby. She lied smoothly, kneeling to hug him tight. He was just checking on us. But we're going to keep the doors locked from now on, okay? Just to be safe. That night, after Leo had finally fallen asleep in the second-floor bedroom, Celine sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. The house creaked and groaned around her, the wind whipping off the lake and battering the window panes. She couldn't leave. If she packed up the car and ran, they would find her. If Chief Miller and Mayor Sterling were willing to murder David in Seattle to protect their secrets, they wouldn't hesitate to run her off a mountain road to get the ledger back. She possessed the only thing keeping these men out of federal prison, but she didn't know how to use it. She needed the whole truth. She needed to know exactly what happened the night Clara Higgins died. The next morning broke with a heavy, oppressive fog that rolled off the dark waters of the lake and swallowed the lower half of the ridge house. It was the kind of morning that felt heavy with impending grief. Celine hadn't slept. She had spent the night mentally reviewing every document she had speed read in David's file. The police report signed by Chief Miller stated that David Hawthorne, highly intoxicated, had driven a speedboat into the rocky shoals of the lake's northern inlet, resulting in the tragic drowning of 20-year-old Clara Higgins. But there was a glaring inconsistency. If David was solely responsible, and Mildred was covering it up by bribing Chief Miller and Mayor Thomas Sterling, why was Mayor Sterling also paying Mildred $12,000 a year? Blackmail only flows in one direction. You don't pay a bribe to protect someone else's nephew. The file had contained a single, cryptic note clipped to the back of the police report. Physical collateral retained. Boathouse locker 4. "Leo, get your boots on," Celine said, her voice sharp with purpose, as she wrapped a thick wool scarf around her neck. "We're going for a walk down to the water. Can I bring my tablet?" Leo asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "No, buddy. Just your boots. We're going exploring." She couldn't leave him in the house. The thought of Chief Miller returning while she was down by the water made her physically ill. They trekked down the steep, overgrown path behind the house. The wet pine needles were slick beneath their boots, and the air smelled heavily of decomposing leaves and fresh rain. At the bottom of the property, partially sunken into the muddy bank, sat an old wooden boathouse. Its roof was sagging, and the double doors facing the water were chained shut. Though the wood was so rotten, the chain was practically useless. Celine found a side door. It was swollen with moisture, but a hard kick to the frame popped it open. Inside, the boathouse was a cavern of shadows, smelling intensely of algae, gasoline, and wet decay. A dilapidated, canvas-covered rowboat sat on a dry dock. Along the back wall was a row of heavy, rusted metal storage lockers. Locker 4. Celine approached it. Unlike the padlock in the basement, this one was completely rusted through. She gripped it with both hands, twisting it violently back and forth until the corroded shackle snapped. She pulled the locker door open. It shrieked in protest. Inside, sitting on a high shelf away from the damp floor, was a bright yellow, heavy-duty dry bag. Celine pulled it down. Her hands were shaking as she unrolled the watertight seal. She tipped the bag upside down over the hood of the old rowboat. Out tumbled a heavy digital camera, a waterproof flashlight, a gold locket with a broken clasp, and a thick, leather-bound journal, sealed in a plastic Ziploc bag. Celine recognized the journal immediately. It was David's handwriting on the cover. He always wrote his D's with a dramatic swoop. She ripped open the plastic bag and opened the journal. The pages were filled with frantic, messy scrawls, entirely unlike David's usually meticulous handwriting. She flipped to the entry, dated the 14th of August, 2010, the day after the boating accident. "Aunt Mildred won't let me talk to the police. She locked me in the guest room. I told her I have to tell them the truth. I wasn't driving. I swear to God, I wasn't driving. Bradley was at the wheel. He was showing off for Clara, trying to take the cove at full throttle. We hit the rocks and I went flying. When I woke up on the shore, Bradley was gone. He just ran. He left us there. I tried to dive for Clara, but it was too dark. It was too deep." Celine gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth as tears finally spilled over her lashes. David wasn't a killer. He hadn't been driving. She continued reading, her vision blurring. "Mildred had a meeting with Mayor Sterling today, Bradley's father. I listened at the door. Sterling was crying, begging her not to ruin his son's life, his political career. Mildred told him she could make it go away. She told him Chief Miller would rewrite the report. But she demanded a price. She owns the mayor now. She owns the chief. And to make the story stick, she needs a scapegoat. She told me if I don't take the fall, she'll tell Miller I premeditated it. She'll say I tried to assault Clara and crash the boat on purpose. Who are they going to believe? The town matriarch and the police chief? Or a 22-year-old kid? She's sending me away. Changing my name. She says I have to pay her every month to ensure my protection from the arrest warrant Miller keeps in his desk. She took everything from me. Celine dropped the journal onto the boat canvas. She couldn't breathe. The sheer, calculated evil of it all was staggering. Mildred Hawthorne had used a young woman's tragic death to enslave the town's leadership, and she had sacrificed her own nephew to do it. David had lived for 12 years under the crushing weight of a crime he didn't commit, paying his own aunt blood money just to stay out of prison, and when he finally couldn't take it anymore, when he stopped paying, or perhaps threatened to expose them, Mayor Sterling and Chief Miller had him killed in Seattle to protect their empire of lies. They had murdered her husband. They had stolen Leo's father. Mom? Leo's small voice broke through the roaring in her ears. He was standing near the doorway, looking at her with frightened eyes. Why are you crying? Are you hurt? Celine wiped her face roughly with the back of her sleeve. The despair that had paralyzed her for the last 3 years suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing rage. No, Leo, Celine said, her voice dropping to a low, steady register she didn't recognize. She carefully placed the journal, the locket, and the camera back into the dry bag. I'm not hurt. I'm just finally seeing clearly. She had walked into Oakhaven as a desperate, broke widow looking for a lifeline. She was leaving this boathouse as a woman holding a loaded gun, aimed directly at the heart of the town. She didn't just have the ledger now. She had the proof. She had David's journal. She had the camera, which likely held photos from that night. Come on, Leo, Celine said, grabbing his hand and striding out of the rotting boathouse. We have work to do. As they climbed the hill back toward the looming silhouette of the Ridge House, Celine's mind was no longer spinning with panic. It was calculating. If she went to the state police, Chief Miller would know before she even crossed the county line. The corruption ran too deep. If she wanted justice for David, and if she wanted to guarantee her son's safety, she couldn't run. She was going to have to play Mildred's game. But she was going to play it to destroy them all. The transition from a terrified, grieving widow to a woman preparing for war happened somewhere on the 2-hour drive to Portland. Celine gripped the steering wheel of her Civic, the rain lashing against the windshield, mirroring the cold, violent storm brewing in her chest. Beside her, Leo slept soundly, his small head resting against a rolled-up fleece jacket. She couldn't leave him in Oakhaven. The town was a spiderweb, and Chief Miller was sitting right at the center, feeling every vibration. Upon reaching Portland, Celine found a highly rated, secure drop-in childcare center in a busy, upscale shopping district. It cost her almost the last of her remaining cash, but the relief of seeing Leo happily engaged with a wall of brightly colored building blocks behind heavy, locked glass doors was worth every penny. She kissed his forehead, promised him a massive pizza for dinner, and walked out into the anonymous city streets. For the next 4 hours, Celine worked with a manic, hyper-focused efficiency. She bought 3 high-definition, wireless hidden cameras from an electronics store, a new laptop, and a prepaid mobile hotspot. Sitting in a crowded, noisy coffee shop where no one would look twice at her, she unzipped the yellow dry bag she had smuggled out of the boathouse. She plugged the water-damaged digital camera into the new laptop. By some miracle, the SD card mounted. There were 52 photos. The first few were standard college-aged party shots. Red plastic cups, a bonfire on the shore of Oakhaven Lake, blurry faces laughing. But as she clicked through to the end, the timeline of the 13th of August, 2010, materialized with damning clarity. Photo 48 showed Clara Higgins, radiant and smiling, sitting on the stern of a sleek fiberglass speedboat. Next to her was David Young, looking slightly uneasy, holding a bottle of water. Photo 50 was the nail in the coffin. It was taken from the passenger seat, looking toward the helm. The driver was a young man with distinct, aristocratic features and a mop of blonde hair. He had one hand on the steering wheel, shoving the throttle forward, and the other holding a bottle of whiskey high in the air, his face contorted in a wild, reckless yell. It was Bradley Sterling, the mayor's son. Celine exported the photos. She scanned the pages of David's journal detailing the blackmail, the police cover-up, and the payments. She combined everything, including photographs she had taken of Mildred's extortion ledger before leaving the Ridge House, into a single, heavily encrypted digital dossier. Then, she set up a dead man's switch, using an encrypted email scheduling service. She drafted a message addressed to the Oregon Attorney General, the FBI field office in Portland, and the news desks of 3 major Pacific Northwest broadcasting networks. The email contained the cloud link to the dossier. She set it to send at exactly midnight. Only she knew the complex password required to cancel it. The trap was primed. Now, she just needed the mice. She drove back to Oak Haven as the afternoon light bled away into a bruised purple twilight. The Ridge House loomed on the hill, looking more like a fortress than a home. Celine moved through the dusty rooms with clinical precision, placing one microscopic camera in the spine of a leather-bound book in the library, another nestled in the intricate woodwork of the living room mantel, and the third directly above the steel door in the basement. At 6:00 p.m., she drove into town. She stopped at the small brick post office adjacent to City Hall. She had prepared 2 identical sealed manila envelopes. Inside each was a single sheet of paper. Glued to the paper was a printout of the photo showing Bradley Sterling driving the boat, and below it, a photocopy of the ledger entry showing the mayor's $12,000 payment. At the bottom, she had written a simple, handwritten note. Mildred's files are open. The boathouse locker is empty. If you want to discuss the terms of your retirement and the Seattle hit and run, come to the Ridge House tonight at 9:00 p.m. Come alone. If you bring deputies, or if you don't show, the state police get the originals. She slid one under the heavy oak door of Mayor Thomas Sterling's private office. She walked 2 blocks in the freezing drizzle and slipped the second into the after-hours drop box at the Oak Haven Police Department, knowing Chief Miller checked it personally every evening. Returning to the Ridge House, Celine locked every door. She closed the heavy velvet drapes. She brewed a pot of black tea, sat in the center of the living room on a floral sofa, and waited. She was no longer Celine Jenkins, the struggling single mother. In the shadows of this terrible house, she had become the heir to Mildred Hawthorne's empire. But unlike Mildred, Celine wasn't looking for a paycheck. She was looking for blood. At 8:52 p.m., the crunch of heavy tires on gravel pierced the silence of the property. Celine watched through a crack in the drapes as a black, unmarked SUV rolled to a stop at the edge of the driveway, its headlights cutting through the swirling fog. 2 figures emerged. They hadn't come alone, but they had come together. She walked to the front door, unlatched the heavy brass chain, and turned the deadbolt. She pulled the door open before they could even knock. Mayor Thomas Sterling stood on the porch, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat despite the freezing temperature. He wore a heavy wool overcoat over a crumpled suit. Beside him stood Chief Harrison Miller, his hand resting casually, yet deliberately, on the butt of his holstered service weapon. "Mrs. Jenkins," Mayor Sterling started, his voice a tight, high-pitched squeak. "I believe there has been a terrible misunderstanding." "Save it." Celine cut him off, her voice dropping the temperature on the porch by another 10 degrees. She stepped back, gesturing into the dimly lit foyer. "Get inside, both of you," Miller sneered, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt crossing his rugged face. "You're playing a dangerous game, little lady." Mildred had the good sense to keep her mouth shut and her head down. "You don't know what you're stepping into." "I stepped into it 3 years ago when you had my husband murdered on Interstate 5, Celine said evenly, closing the heavy door behind them and locking it. "Living room." Now, she led them into the space where she had spent the afternoon setting her trap. She took a seat in a high-backed armchair, gesturing for them to sit on the sofa opposite her. Sterling collapsed onto the cushions like a man whose strings had been cut. Miller remained standing, pacing like a caged wolf. "Let's be very clear about what is happening here," Celine began, folding her hands in her lap to hide their slight trembling. "I have David's journal. I have the digital camera from the boathouse with the time-stamped photos of Bradley driving that boat. And I have Aunt Mildred's master ledger." Sterling buried his face in his hands, letting out a ragged sob. "My God, Bradley is running for state senate. The primaries are next month. This will destroy him. It will destroy all of us." "That's the point, Thomas," Celine said, using his first name with calculated disrespect. "You let an innocent boy take the fall for your son's drunken negligence. You paid a corrupt cop to forge the police reports. And when my husband finally had enough of funding your dirty secrets, you silenced him." "We didn't kill David," Sterling blurted out, looking up with wide, frantic eyes. "I swear to you, Mildred was the one pulling the strings. We were just surviving her." Celine's eyes snapped to Miller. The chief had stopped pacing. His slate-grey eyes were fixed on her, calculating the angles. "Is that true, Chief?" Celine asked. "Did Mildred order the hit in Seattle?" Miller let out a dry, rasping laugh. Mildred was a greedy old bat, but she wasn't a killer. She liked her money too much. Dead men don't pay rent. "Then who did?" Celine demanded, her voice rising. "David was weak," Miller said, taking a slow step toward her. He unclasped the leather strap securing his firearm. He called Thomas here in a panic, said he was going to the feds, said the guilt of Clara's death was eating him alive, and he couldn't live a lie anymore. Thomas panicked. "But I handle problems in this town. I have a buddy up in Seattle, private security contractor, doesn't mind getting his bumper dented for the right price. It was clean, a tragedy in the rain. Cops up there closed it as an unsolved hit and run in 2 weeks. Celine felt a tear slide down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. Hearing it confirmed hearing the casual, callous way this man dismissed the life of the man she loved. The father of her child solidified the ice in her veins. "So, you admit it," Celine said softly. "I admit I protect my town, and I protect the people who pay me," Miller snarled, pulling his gun from its holster and aiming it squarely at Celine's chest. Mayor Sterling shrieked, pressing himself into the corner of the sofa. "Harrison!" "No. Are you insane? You can't just shoot her." "Shut up, Tommy," Miller barked. He looked back at Celine. "Where are the files, Celine? The camera, the journal. Hand them over, and maybe we can make this look like a tragic suicide. A grieving widow who just couldn't handle the pressure of an old, drafty house." Celine didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair, a grim, humorless smile touching the corners of her mouth. "You really think I'm that stupid?" she asked. Miller frowned, the gun wavering slightly. "What?" "I'm a millennial, Chief Miller. I don't hide paper files in a basement safe. I use the cloud." Celine pointed to the spine of the book on the shelf behind him. Then, to the mantel. "You're on 3 separate, high-definition, audio-enabled hidden cameras. Everything you just said, your confession to forging police reports, your confession to hiring a hitman to kill David Hawthorne has been streaming directly to a secure, encrypted server off-site." Miller's face drained of color. He whipped his head around, scanning the room, his gun tracking shadows. "Furthermore," Celine continued, her voice ringing with absolute authority, "there is an automated email queued to send at exactly midnight. It contains the cloud link with all the evidence, the photos of Bradley, and a copy of this very video stream. It's going to the FBI in Portland, the State Attorney General, and every major news desk from Seattle to Eugene." "You're lying," Miller spat, though the tremor in his hands betrayed his panic. "Cancel it. Open your laptop and cancel it right now." "I can't," Celine lied smoothly. "It's a dead man's switch. It requires a randomized two-factor authentication token that I left in a locker in Portland. If I don't input it by midnight, the emails send. And if you shoot me, you'll never find it anyway. The clock is ticking, gentlemen. It's 9:15. You have less than 3 hours to get to a jurisdiction that doesn't care who you are. Because by tomorrow morning, you will be the most hunted men in the Pacific Northwest. Sterling scrambled off the sofa, crawling toward the front door on his hands and knees. I'm leaving. I'm taking the jet. I have money in the Caymans. Harrison, we have to run. Miller stood frozen, his gun still raised, his mind violently crashing against the inescapable reality of his defeat. He had walked into the Ridge House, expecting to bully a frightened widow. Instead, he had walked into a steel trap, meticulously designed by a woman who had nothing left to lose. The silence in the living room of the Ridge House was absolute, thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the howling wind battering the coastal pines outside and the ragged, panicked breathing of Mayor Thomas Sterling as he clawed his way toward the front door. Chief Harrison Miller stood perfectly still, his service weapon leveled at Celine's chest. The slate-grey eyes that had terrorized the citizens of Oakhaven for 2 decades were wide, darting frantically around the room, as if he could spot the hidden camera lenses with sheer willpower. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, a predator who had just realized he was standing inside a cage. You're bluffing, Miller whispered, though the words lacked their previous venom. His hands, usually so steady, betrayed a microscopic tremor. Am I? Celine asked, her voice dangerously calm. She didn't break eye contact. She couldn't afford to show an ounce of fear, even as her heart hammered violently against her ribs. Shoot me, Harrison. See what happens. You might silence me, but you can't stop a cloud server. At exactly 12:00 a.m., the digital dossier hits the inbox of the special agent in charge at the FBI's Portland field office. It hits the news desk at KGW Channel 8. It goes to the Oregon Attorney General. The second my pulse stops, you guarantee your own execution. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, projecting an aura of complete, unshakable certainty. You have 2 hours and 40 minutes to pack a bag and disappear. If I were you, I'd start driving. Sterling had managed to haul himself up using the brass handle of the front door. Harrison, he shrieked, his face a mask of pure terror. She has us. We have to go. If Bradley goes down for Clara's death, my entire legacy is ruined. We have to get to the airstrip. Miller slowly lowered the gun. The realization of his absolute defeat seemed to age him 10 years in a matter of seconds. He was a small-town tyrant who had just been outmaneuvered by a desperate, grieving mother. You're a dead woman, Jenkins, Miller spat, holstering his weapon with a violent, jerky motion. You think destroying us brings your husband back? You think this town will ever let you live in peace? I don't plan on staying, Celine replied coldly. Get out of my house. Miller turned on his heel and stormed toward the entryway, grabbing Sterling by the collar of his expensive wool coat and shoving him out the door into the freezing rain. Celine didn't move until she heard the heavy doors of the unmarked SUV slam shut and the tires tear out of the gravel driveway, speeding recklessly down the winding mountain road. Only then did the adrenaline crash into her system. She collapsed back into the floral armchair, her entire body shaking so violently she had to grip the armrests to keep from sliding onto the floor. She had done it. She had looked the men who murdered her husband in the eye and broken them. But the danger wasn't over. Desperate men made fatal mistakes, and she couldn't risk them doubling back once the shock wore off. Celine sprang into action. She sprinted upstairs, tossing her few belongings into her duffel bag. She grabbed the heavy black ledger from the basement desk, the physical digital camera, and David's journal, shoving them deep into her bag. She didn't bother packing anything else. The house and its ghosts could keep the rest. By 9:45 p.m., Celine was back in her Honda Civic, flying down the mountain roads, away from Oakhaven. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, the windshield wipers struggling to keep the glass clear. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for any sign of headlights, tracking her through the dark. The 2-hour drive to Portland felt like a lifetime. Her mind raced with a million terrifying possibilities. What if the email didn't send? What if the authorities didn't believe her? What if Miller had called in a favor and had state troopers waiting for her on the interstate? But the miles vanished beneath her tires, and the glowing skyline of Portland eventually breached the horizon. At 11:30 p.m., Celine pulled up to the secure drop-in childcare center. The doors were locked, but a night attendant buzzed her in. Leo was asleep on a small cot in the quiet room, clutching his stuffed bear. "Hey, buddy," Celine whispered, gently shaking his shoulder. "Time to go. We're going to a hotel tonight." Leo blinked sleepily, rubbing his eyes. "Are we going back to the scary house?" "Never again," Celine promised, kissing his forehead. "We're safe now." They checked into a crowded, brightly lit chain hotel near the Portland airport. Celine bolted the door, slid the chain lock into place, and wedged a heavy desk chair beneath the handle. She set up her new laptop on the small desk, connected to the mobile hotspot, and watched the digital clock in the corner of the screen. 11:58 p.m. 11:59 p.m. 12:00 a.m. The automated script fired. Celine watched the confirmation pop up on her screen. The emails had been successfully delivered. The servers had received the data packets. The secrets of the Ridge House were no longer secrets. The trap had officially snapped shut. Celine pulled Leo close to her on the bed, wrapped her arms around him, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to truly, deeply weep. The explosion happened faster and with far more devastating force than Celine could have ever anticipated. In the sterile, impersonal quiet of the airport hotel room, the hours between midnight and dawn stretched into a torturous eternity. Celine sat cross-legged on the foot of the bed, watching Leo's chest rise and fall in the dim glow of the muted television. Every time a car door slammed in the parking lot below, her breath hitched. She had pulled the pin on a digital grenade, but until she knew who had caught it, she was still a target. At exactly 5:14 a.m., her prepaid burner phone vibrated violently against the nightstand. Celine snatched it up before the second ring. "Hello? Am I speaking with Celine Jenkins?" The voice on the other end was a deep, gravelly baritone, stripped of any conversational warmth. It was the voice of a man who had been awake all night, reading something horrifying. "This is Senior Special Agent Gregory Hayes with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Portland Field Office. We received a highly encrypted data packet from your servers at exactly 00:00 hours. Celine exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 years. "Did you look at it? Did you see the ledger? I have a joint task force currently reviewing the video and audio streams you captured at the Oakhaven property," Agent Hayes replied, his tone shifting into something distinctly respectful. "Mrs. Jenkins, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You have triggered what is likely going to be the largest corruption probe in the history of this state. Where are you currently located? We need to secure you and your son immediately. I have the physical ledger, the original SD card, and David's journal," Celine said, her voice raspy but resolute. "I want absolute, ironclad immunity for my late husband's forced financial involvement before I hand them over." "You have it," Hayes stated, without a second of hesitation. "Your husband was a victim of a systemic extortion ring. We are mobilizing federal tactical units to Oakhaven as we speak. I am sending an armored transport to your hotel to bring you to the federal building downtown. Do not open your door for anyone except my agents." By the time the sun fully breached the horizon, painting the Portland sky in bruised shades of purple and grey, the national news had caught the scent of blood. Celine sat in a secure, windowless debriefing room within the FBI field office, a styrofoam cup of black coffee cooling in her hands. Leo was asleep on a leather sofa in an adjoining, guarded family room. On the wall-mounted television in front of her, the local KGW Channel 8 morning anchor looked visibly pale, pressing an earpiece into her ear as she read the breaking bulletin. "We are receiving unprecedented reports out of the coastal town of Oakhaven. A massive, coordinated federal raid is currently underway. Our chopper feeds show dozens of FBI tactical vehicles swarming the Oakhaven Police Department and the local city hall." The screen cut to aerial footage. The heavy, oppressive fog of Oakhaven was pierced by a sea of flashing red and blue lights. The town that had suffocated David, the town that had tried to bury Celine, was being aggressively, methodically, dismantled on live television. Arrest warrants have been executed for Oakhaven Mayor Thomas Sterling, his son, State Senate candidate Bradley Sterling, and several high-ranking city officials. Sources close to the investigation say the staggering list of charges includes racketeering, grand extortion, and the suppression of evidence regarding the 2010 tragic boating death of 20-year-old Clara Higgins. Agent Hayes stepped into the room, shutting the heavy door behind him to muffle the chaotic symphony of ringing phones and shouting agents in the bullpen. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp with adrenaline. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Celine. "You did incredible work, Mrs. Jenkins," Hayes said, dropping a thick manila folder onto the table. "Most of our seasoned undercover operatives couldn't have engineered a trap that flawless. You caught them in a complete, undeniable dead end." "Did you get them?" Celine asked, leaning forward, her knuckles white. "We got Bradley Sterling an hour ago," Hayes confirmed, flipping open the folder. He was at a high-dollar campaign fundraising breakfast in Eugene. Tactical teams pulled him right off the podium. He surrendered without a fight. Mayor Thomas Sterling was a bit trickier. He attempted to flee the jurisdiction. We apprehended him at a private airstrip just outside of Bend. He was sitting on the tarmac, trying to board a chartered Cessna to Cabo San Lucas with a duffel bag full of bearer bonds. He was weeping when they put the cuffs on him. Celine felt a dark, vindicating satisfaction settle in her chest. "And Chief Miller?" Hayes paused, his expression hardening into a grim mask. He closed the folder. Chief Miller didn't run. He knew he couldn't outrun a federal digital footprint. He went back to the precinct, barricaded the doors, and locked himself in his private office. "What happened?" Celine asked, her heart rate spiking. When the SWAT team breached his office door, it was too late. He had taken his own life with his service weapon, Hayes said quietly. But he left a written confession on his desk. It corroborated every single word in your video feed, Mrs. Jenkins. More importantly, he gave up the name of the private security contractor in Seattle, the man he hired to run your husband off the road. "We dispatched the Seattle field office 10 minutes ago. They already have the contractor in custody. David's murder is officially solved." Celine closed her eyes. A long, shuddering sob tore through her throat. The nightmare was finally over. David's murderers were either dead or bound for federal penitentiaries. The crushing weight that had sat on her chest for 3 long years finally began to lift. Over the next few weeks, the fallout from the Oakhaven syndicate dominated national headlines. The town's entire infrastructure was gutted by the Department of Justice. Dozens of old, fabricated convictions were overturned, and the families who had been bled dry by Mildred Hawthorne's merciless blackmail empire finally saw their extortionists dragged into the unforgiving light of a federal courtroom. But the most profound moment of closure for Celine came a month later. She arranged to meet with Clara Higgins's parents at a quiet, independent coffee shop in downtown Portland. They were an older couple, deeply weathered by a decade of unresolved grief and unanswered questions. They looked nervous, almost fragile, as Celine sat across from them. Without a word, Celine reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. She slid it across the table. Inside was a high-resolution printout of the photograph from the boathouse, the image clearly showing Bradley Sterling at the helm of the boat, a bottle of whiskey in the air, while David sat in the passenger seat. She also handed them a photocopy of the page from David's journal, where he detailed his desperate, failed attempt to dive into the dark water to save Clara. Mrs. Higgins stared at the photograph, her hands trembling so violently the paper shook, the dam broke, and she began to weep. Deep, agonizing sobs. "We hated him," Mr. Higgins whispered, his voice cracking as tears spilled down his own weathered cheeks. He looked up at Celine, his eyes pleading for forgiveness. "For 12 years, we hated your husband, Mrs. Jenkins. We thought he was a reckless, arrogant monster who killed our little girl and bought his way out of it. To know, he tried to save her. To know, he paid for the truth with his own life." He reached across the table, grasping Celine's hands in a surprisingly strong grip. "Thank you. You didn't just bring down those men. You gave us our daughter's memory back. You gave us peace." There was one final, unexpected twist to Mildred Hawthorne's dark legacy. In late December, as the first snow flurries began to dust the Pacific Northwest, Celine met with Abigail Croft, the estate attorney, in her plush Seattle office. The federal government has, as expected, seized the contents of the hidden basement room, the property of the Ridge House, and all bank accounts associated with the extortion ring, Abigail explained, adjusting her designer glasses. However, Mildred Hawthorne was a remarkably wealthy woman, long before she began her illicit activities. There was a secondary, entirely legitimate trust fund originally established by your maternal grandfather. It was completely insulated from Mildred's criminal enterprises. Abigail slid a heavy, watermarked piece of paper across the mahogany desk. It was a certified bank statement. Celine stared at the bolded number at the bottom of the page. It was over $2.4 million. Mildred explicitly stipulated in her original will that this specific trust was to bypass her control entirely and go directly to David upon his 30th birthday. Abigail said softly, her professional demeanor softening. When he died, the trust legally defaulted to his next of kin, to Leo. It's clean money, Celine. The feds have audited it 3 times. It's yours. Celine walked out of the law office and stepped into the crisp, bright Seattle afternoon. The air felt cleaner, lighter. She held Leo's hand tightly as they walked down the bustling, festive sidewalk, the sounds of the city rushing around them. She didn't fight the federal seizure of the Ridge House. She couldn't stomach the thought of another family ever living within those corrupted, decaying walls. A few months later, at the direction of the state, the Gothic monstrosity was demolished. The land was cleared, the basement filled in with concrete, and the rocky outcropping was transformed into a beautiful public park, overlooking the water. A park that Celine quietly petitioned to have officially named the Clara Higgins Memorial Reserve. With the trust fund, Celine bought a beautiful, modest, sunlit home in a quiet suburb of Portland, far away from the shadows of Oakhaven. She paid off the crippling debts that had haunted her, established a secure college fund for Leo, and for the first time, since the rain-slicked highway took her husband away, she finally allowed herself to truly live. The story of the Ridge House serves as a chilling reminder that the darkest monsters rarely hide under the bed. They sit in offices of power, shielded by badges and political influence. Celine Jenkins' journey from a desperate, impoverished widow to the architect of a corrupt town's destruction highlights the terrifying lengths a mother will go to protect her child and honor the truth. It underscores a harsh reality. Sometimes, inheriting a legacy isn't about wealth, but about unearthing generational sins that demand to be balanced. David was a casualty of a machine designed to protect the privileged, but his love for his family inadvertently provided the very tools needed to dismantle it. Ultimately, Celine didn't just survive the ghosts of Oakhaven. She brought them to the light, proving that even the most deeply buried secrets cannot withstand the glaring fire of an absolute, unwavering demand for justice.